Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos, although I have it on the best of authority that you're probably not. Although, if you are, do please get in contact, and we can try and resolve the bureaucratic error which must have caused that problem in the first place. Well, as you'll remember, last week here on Musical Talk, we were talking about the 2021 Edinburgh Festival Fringe, although in a more generic and general kind of a way. We were really concentrating on what the Fringe itself is. And it was worth remembering that because in 2021 the Fringe itself was very different to any of the previous Fringes for at least 2 generations. And as part of that, there was one significant change which I think we'll see replicated into the future for future Edinburgh Festival Fringes and indeed other Fringe festivals across the world. And that's the introduction of virtual musical performances, either via live streaming, as at the Hollywood Fringe, or in a series of recordings, which was the option at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Now, virtual theatre has been around for a very long time, but last year, the main year of COVID 2020, of course, gave it an enormous impetus and push, and it's now become a viable form of theatre, and particularly for Fringe, as this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe testifies, because when it came to the category of musicals and opera, there were many, many more virtual offerings than there were actual physical offerings, i.e. shows that you could see live in a theatrical venue. But virtual theatre is a term we've used very broadly, when in fact it encompasses lots of different kinds of format. All it really tells you is that the show you're going to watch will be on a screen rather than in a theatre. Within that, there's a myriad of possibilities, and that was reflected in many of the choices taken by the people putting shows on at this year's Fringe. So in today's episode, you'll be hearing me and Tim talking in depth about 2 shows that you could have seen as part of this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe, The Girls of St Trinian's and The Crooked Spire. But we'll be framing that conversation as part of a larger discussion about the format opportunities of the various different ways of putting a show on virtually, because these 2 shows took a very different approach, and there are strengths and weaknesses attached to both. So let's not hang around, let's get into the order of the day. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Tim about formats and shows. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Tim, lovely to see you again.
You say that, but we'll find out.
But that's whether it's going to be lovely to hear you again, and that could be a different thing entirely.
We leave that to the listeners. They can either write in and say they didn't like it, write in and say they did like it, or do what they normally do and not write in at all.
Absolutely. Well, it's in the ear of the beholder, I think.
Yes.
And talking of ears, I'm glad that you have yours with you.
Yes, here they are. Pretty, aren't they?
Yes, thank you. Now we'll put them back on.
Right.
You used them, I noticed, yesterday, as I did, because we have watched a number of Edinburgh Festival Fringe.
You don't watch with your ears. That's ridiculous.
Actually, that's true. One doesn't. Well,
no. However, we did use our ears because there was also sound to these little movies. They've started doing that now. I gather it's been quite popular ever since The Jazz Singer.
Pictures and sound. It'll never catch on. But actually, it's interesting you use The Jazz Singer because let's talk about virtual musicals, and particular the offerings at this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe for musical theatre were, I would have said, 1/3 physical theatre, which
which you can go to Edinburgh and see.
Indeed, and 2/3 virtual. So there were about 17 musicals on in total.
How does one? So I have a question about that straight away, actually, which is that how do you? Because we've seen these where we are, which is not in Edinburgh. So how does one get access to these
Well,
virtual musicals?
During the run of Edinburgh Festival Fringe, they're all on the online catalogue.
I see.
And you pick the ones you want. So you're still buying a ticket, but the advantage is, of course, that the ticket runs until the end of the festival, which is the last minute of the 30th of August.
So provided you redeem your ticket and watch the thing before then you can do it.
But what's interesting to me was that you buy your tickets through the EdFringe website, but some of them are on what's called the Fringe player, which is their version of a kind of YouTube
sort of
player.
iPlayer type of thing, yeah.
But there are a few that direct you to elsewhere. So there was a show called The Crooked Spire, for example, which directed you to an unlisted YouTube page.
Oh, okay.
And there was another one which was on something called C Player, C being one of the
venues,
one of the umbrella venues.
They are getting small these days, aren't they?
Umbrella venues.
Yes.
Room for two, probably.
Yes.
But
the intimate, one-on-one type of theatre.
But it did direct you to lots of different places, so it's not yet all in one. But there is a Fringe viewer, which seems to be the main EdFringe virtual thing. So that's how you watch them, and it seems that you can watch them more than once you've bought your ticket.
Okay.
So if you liked it and then you want to come back to it a week later,
Well, I
if it's
can't
still
remember
on.
an occasion at Edinburgh where I ever did want to watch anything for them. Maybe once or twice.
I have. There are a number of times I have seen shows twice, but they have to be fairly special.
Yeah.
And this obviously is a real outcome of the COVID year that we had last year in 2020 and has lingered into 2021. So there has been an Edinburgh Festival Fringe, which I think is miraculous. But as we all suspected, a lot of us watched virtual theatre last year in a way that we hadn't previously. And so this year, adding virtual theatre to the Fringe, particularly in an environment where COVID is still not yet eradicated, it's still an important part of our lives and we have to be careful, then it seemed a very natural and sensible thing to do. But I was reminded immediately, Tim, that actually you've always been fairly visionary on things like this, and I remember many years ago you were saying it is about time people started writing musicals specifically for online virtual performance.
Well, of course, this had happened at that time because Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog is, I don't know if it's off-quoted these days, but it was a thing that Joss Whedon did with Neil Patrick Harris, and they put it out on the internet. So, I mean, the potential had been seen quite early on, But the question is, what makes it special, that it's online rather than you just make a film and you release the film via whatever means are current, because now that's how films are released, is
streamed
online.
Yes, quite.
And maybe the answer is there is no difference. I think that there's always been a tradition of DVDs and things like that, which are recordings of shows but done to a professional level. I mean, we've had those on TV for many years, didn't we, and stuff like that. So,
you mean filmed at Gypsy? They put a camera in the theatre?
Yes, and you get to see the show as if, it's shot from multiple angles on one particular night. I mean, that's always been a tradition. Well, of course, nowadays it goes the opposite way as well. You get filmed inserts sometimes in a live show, a video of the performance. So we're getting into a period where this hybridisation is all. And,
although when you were in a theatre watching that, you'd still be in a theatre watching the video insert.
Yes,
so there'll be other people sitting on either side of you.
Yeah. So the paradigms are all shifting as to what sort of counts as theatre and what doesn't count as theatre, and it's an interesting question, I suppose. But obviously, COVID has forced people's hands and compelled them to enter the online space in different ways. I think there's fundamentally two ways. Although I've only seen.
I'm going to argue three, but I want to hear your three.
You've probably seen more of these shows than I have. So, but the two from the ones that we've seen, one is the sort of Zoom production. In other words, single cameras in multiple locations, one performer in front of it. They may well interact with the other performers as if in a Zoom conversation, but basically we're talking about proper lockdown type of theatre where none of the cast are in the same location because they couldn't in a lockdown,
because of social distancing,
and they're doing it in front of their green screen at home or wherever they're doing it, or out in the back garden against a hedge or whatever, as I like to do, that sort of thing. So we also saw Peter Duncan's panto that he did, which he filmed in his back garden.
Yeah.
But he did so with multiple performers in the scene. And of course he was able to do that because halfway through the COVID year, the restrictions eased sufficiently that people could meet again and that they could sort of get together, provided they went with certain restrictions. And then there's the one which is really at the end of the lockdown, which is essentially you can bubble people. And so you can have a full cast, you can have them in a theatre, you point cameras at that stage as they're performing as if it was a live show, and that's what you film, which of course is something we're all familiar with from having televised live shows and so on.
Indeed. And there are 2 or 3 different ways of doing that as well, aren't there? There's the single static camera just catching everything the screen does, which is a fairly passive way of doing it, but catches
it's not very
everything.
interesting,
Or there's the cut where you've got 2 or 3 cameras and you move from one.
That's usually more
vision
successful.
mixed, if nothing.
That's what we're used to in TV versions of filmings of, say, West End shows and stuff, which has been done occasionally. No one's actually sort of gone to the level of like really filming them in the sense of like, doing it with proper film grainy quality.
Well, you have identified the 3. I would slightly define them, or rather I might like to clarify. I agree with you. You've got the lockdown, piecemeal, Zoom, Skype, whatever you want to call it, MS Teams, other platforms are available. But yes, that one, the pieced together, if you like, musical out of force. I doubt that's going to be a form that lasts into the future.
It's difficult to see how.
Because it's disappointing in some senses.
Yeah.
Then, exactly as you say, they point the camera at an actual production taking place, and however you cut that is entirely up to you, but that's what you're getting. And then, yes, the Peter Duncan one is the very good example. I was going to offer up as the third option the produced as if film. Yeah. Maybe not 90 minutes, but for example, at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe this year, there was a video, only about 45 minutes, of Kurt Weill's 7 Deadly Sins.
Right.
And when I watched that, it was more... It felt more like a film. It was 2 women in a household environment. I assume they were bubbled. I mean, I should say it's in the original German, so and it's advertised as a physical theatre piece, and so it was. But because it was in a house setting, in very high quality definition and subtitles for English, it had the feel of at least a television programme, if not a feature film. It's not long enough for a feature film, but it had that sense. Peter Duncan, I think, falls into that category, because although his is a pantomime and therefore much more rumbustious, it felt like it would have been or could have been on television.
Well, I think also the other thing about the Peter Duncan thing is that there's a sense of theatricality to it, in the sense that no one's really able to pretend. Like, they're not making a film where they try to convince you that the photorealism of the film.
Yes.
So in other words, the example you just gave, you can, I guess the thing is set in a house, I don't know, and therefore you can believe in it in the way you would believe in a cinema movie. But the Peter Duncan thing was, we are being theatrical in a non-theatrical setting, namely the back garden.
And we felt that
and
when we watched it.
And we don't expect you to believe that the back garden is the Giant's Kingdom or any of the things that it seems to be. It clearly isn't.
Yeah.
But we're just being theatrical in that thing in the same way we would in a theatre, and we wouldn't expect you to believe this theatre is that place, because we can't have a photorealistic set.
Oddly, it's a black box that just happens to be the houses of the local street. Yes, right.
So I think that's where these things become theatrical, and they're not just short films, because they don't follow the conventions of films where you try to have, except for dogme and stuff like that, but most film isn't theatrical. You point a camera at something that looks like the thing that you want the audience to believe those characters are in, and you do that with varying degrees of realism depending on your budget, basically. Or whether you've chosen a very easy thing to replicate. If you decide your film is going to have a Victorian street in it, then if you're going to make a film, you better have the street, you better have the cobbles, you better have the costumes, you better have the passers-by, you better have the market stalls, you better have the buildings looking convincing. If you're going to do that in a theatrical way, well, you could do that on a contemporary street and theatricalise it and say, I'm wearing a top hat, I'm Victorian. And you could film that, and that's theatre.
Well, that's interesting, because I think we will be touching on that, because we're going to be talking today, to a greater or lesser degree, about 2 musicals which are part of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, St Trinian's and The Crooked Spire.
Yes.
Now, of those 2, they fall into 2 different formats we've been talking about. But the point you've just made, I want to briefly say, I think reflects the Crooked Spire a little more, because that's the Zoom one, which is piecemeal and edited together. At one level, it was very ambitious, because they are trying, in that very reduced situation of COVID isolation and people being in different parts of the country, probably, to edit things together to make it look real. It's all filmed outside because of social distancing, and it's filmed near a church. If it's not the actual Chesterfield Cathedral, it's a church doubling for the Chesterfield Cathedral. Yeah. So it's got what you might call the realism aspects of it there. But the danger is that actually the costumes aren't necessarily going to be full on sort of mid 14th century costumes. Where does the realism go? How far do you take it?
Well, I think that's right, and I think it's actually quite a hard judgment, because I mean this is a judgment that you make in theatre. Is like, will a top hat suffice, even though I'm just basically wearing a black t-shirt and some trousers, one hopes.
Unless you're Donald.
It can be a very stripped back production, as it were, but yes. Oh yes, unless you're done with them in Scotland. Or do you say, well, actually, a frock coat is needed here, or do you say we need the trousers? And then are you getting too far into realism because then you expect it from the other characters, and then you start to wonder, well, why they're dressed completely convincingly? Why isn't the set convincing? And so on and so on. So basically, this is the constant judgment call of all theatre, particularly theatre which doesn't try to be realistic, which is to say pretty much all theatre.
Although some of it really pretends. I mean, I'll give you another musical example from the Edinburgh Festival Fringe this year. There's a show called Carnegie, the Star-Spangled Scotchman. That's how it's called. And it's a full-on... It's a sort of 2-hour show, and it's about the Carnegie who's famous. And obviously it's all Victorian. And they wear top hats and morning coats, as in the kind of things you would see at a wedding.
Right.
And indeed, presumably, that's where they hired it from, or some
equivalent. Yes, I imagine so, yes. That's the usual source of morning dress.
But that is a shorthand for Victorian clothing. But it isn't actually at all realistic with Victorian clothing, if you know anything about Victorian clothing, because actually Victorian tailoring is terrible.
Right.
And suits very rarely actually match, ironically.
Okay, yeah.
A waistcoat and a jacket and trousers may all be different, and they still be a suit, which of course you wouldn't recognise today as a suit, because it doesn't match.
It doesn't work,
But I think you have to be relatively knowledgeable about Victorian tailoring, as I am, to be irritated by that. And I shouldn't be irritated by that. And of course, they are only making a nod towards Victoriana.
I think, generally speaking, the attitude in a lot of theatre is that less is more.
Yeah, I agree. Let the imagination do the work.
Because the minute you start creating combinations and pictures...
I didn't think they were wearing combinations. I couldn't see. He was wearing a morning coat over it.
But you suddenly... You create expectations. You create a bar, and you want to leave.
There's a book in that.
You want to create a bar as low as possible because you want people to just go with their imaginations and not get hung up on. Does that look realistic enough?
In fact, let the magic of theatre do what it's supposed to do, rather than making it realistic, which is the language of film.
Exactly. So, anyway, there are many, many ways of sort of doing that, and you can go literally from the absolute stripped down thing of practically a radio play where people just happen to be standing around doing everything with their voices really and their physicality, up to things where you have huge extravaganzas where everyone's in beautiful Cecil Beaton. So anyway, that's the context within which these choices have to be made. But the sort of static camera type of thing, obviously you're relying on a lot of other things that we haven't really had to think about before. What technology is everybody using? Do they all have the same soundtrack going on behind them? Do they all have the same...
definition on their camera, for goodness sake.
Yeah, exactly. Or aspect ratio, for that matter. So it creates this whole sort of set of editing problems and challenges. Well, we can talk about the Crooked Spire. So, that's, as far as I can tell, that's a kind of sort of drama-y, cantate type of thing that was done locally and that they've adapted for this sort of Zoom thing. And basically they have a number of characters, and it relies on a sort of a mixture of monologues to camera, which I think work better because you don't have to sort of get hung up on the relationship to the characters. But they also did dialogue scenes where literally one person was in one place and another person was visibly in quite a different place, and they would nonetheless have dialogue. And you're either supposed to go, it doesn't matter about the realism of this, one's got this behind them and the other's got that behind them, and clearly they're not in the same space. And sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't really. It was just sort of a bit hit and miss, wasn't it? Yeah, and all these sort of various characters. It certainly was challenging when they had to sort of hit each other, or in one case, murder each other.
Yes.
where the where the hands sort of went out of frame from one person's shot, and then I think the sort of other hands, visibly not belonging to the first person's hands, appeared in the frame of the other person's shot.
By necessity, because of the nature of the... yes.
I think my favourite was the boot, where the guy had to stamp down on someone and then this other boot sort of just appears in the camera. It was, anyway, but it didn't always work.
And that's a format problem, isn't it? I say, well done to them for trying to make something out of very difficult circumstance.
No one's made rules up for this yet. I think a lot of the sort of Zoom theatre, because there's been quite a bit of this, over time. Some of it is to do with just like it is a Zoom conversation and that is the setting. So the fact that they're all in different living rooms makes perfect sense because they're having a Zoom conversation. So some people have tried to do it that way, and other people have just said, let's just do it like it's a tabletop reading of something, and that's worked perfectly well, I suppose. Yeah, and other people have just tried to sort of go beyond that constraint and to sort of essentially say these characters are in a place somewhere, and we're being theatrical to imagine where that is.
To try and make it cohere in some sense, absolutely.
But it is, it's also the other challenge with Zoom, as we all know, as we've all discovered, if we use it, or any of those platforms, is the whole sort of timing and interruptions thing. that's really hard to do.
In dialogue?
Yeah, if you're trying to do natural theatre and the person's in the same space, you sort of interrupt each other or do whatever you do.
Or take your cues from each other,
Yeah, you can time it much better, whereas with the Zoom thing, particularly if it's pre-recorded and it's not actually Zoom, so you haven't got the other person on the other end of a line to you, you're just trying to leave space for their lines, that becomes a real editing challenge because especially if they've got like a 2-page speech, you can just quietly, patiently react to and then like come in with your line at the end of, you can like, should this be like 2 minutes or 2.5 minutes?
Well, it does have the effect, doesn't it, of making the cues look a bit slow in one or two cases, because someone is imagining someone else responding to what they're saying at a slower pace than the film you actually then get to see. Unless you do that terribly distracting flash cut to flash cut to flash cut, which is actually works, it's going to take you out of the drama. Then you get the other problem, which is that other people speak at different paces, and so there's quite a lot of very slow cue pickups, which is not deliberate because they're not actually picking up a cue at all.
My feel is there's a lot of experimentation to be done before this particular format works, and of course the only reason it existed was the necessity of people couldn't meet at all, during the proper lockdowns. So, will it survive? Probably not, to be honest.
As a format, it's the least satisfactory of the ones available.
It hasn't
and it has no
anything.
purpose.
It hasn't produced anything that's maybe it has, but I've not seen anything in that format that I thought I wouldn't have preferred to have seen something in another.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So, just back to the Cricket Bar itself. It tells the story. I think you said it was based on a novel.
That's right.
A murder mystery, where they're building St Mary and All Saints in Chesterfield, which was built in the
1360 is the setting of the story.
And I think the bit that we saw had to do with the installation of a windlass, which is quite a technical subject for a musical. And I think it was actually a little bit influenced by The Hired Man, the Howard Goodall musical, which is obviously set much later. I think we're in the 19th century in The Hired Man, but it had that sort of honest Sons of Toil type of dialogue.
Well, indeed, there's a song in it called The Journeyman.
Yes,
there's
that's right.
There's a young boy who's of apprentice age who wants to be a journeyman.
Yes.
As in a journeyman worker, which is a phrase we sort of still use today.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so it has those sorts of things. It has quite a bouncy score at other times, but yeah.
But the reason we're talking about it most is because of its format, and you have to sort of take a big old pinch of salt because of the trouble. I admire them for trying. The other thing that we didn't realise till afterwards when we researched it was that it was actually, because it's a 40-minute show on the video,
but it's not extracts.
Yes, it's not the full
yes.
story.
No.
But unfortunately, I don't think that was quite clear to us until afterwards.
No,
and so it doesn't actually conclude in any significant way.
That's right. Yeah, we didn't quite figure out. Well, we sort of quite got to know who done it, or at least if it was revealed, it was revealed in a way that
obliquely,
yes, implicitly, shall we say?
Yeah.
So that was that.
We should talk about something they did do, which I was quite surprised and impressed by. Obviously, because of social distancing, they could not have two people in a room together.
No.
So there was a couple of times where they used fairly good special effects. So there was a completely CGI section where we saw the windlass, which is a walking cog, if you like. You walk; it's a human treadmill,
it's like a treadmill
in a circle. You work, and it brings up it turns the axle and therefore brings things up to that floor, up to the idea in this case is it going to speed up the building of the spire of the church,
because you've got to get the heavy stuff up the top. Yeah.
It's a way of getting stuff up to the top without having to carry it. And there's a fairly lengthy sequence of two people walking in the windlass to show you this happening, whilst there's a kind of anthem to the windlass being sung. And I was impressed by that. I thought, well, they've actually found a really quite impressive way of overcoming the fact you can't have two people in it and they don't have a windlass.
No,
so
right.
And there were some other moments, weren't there, where you noticed they'd sort of match-shotted out the actual spire of the church,
yes, to try
and put in some derricks and cranes to show it under construction.
Yeah, I mean, it was a mixture of approaches and so on. Yeah, with differing degrees of realism, shall we say?
Yeah. And success, I should say. It's difficult to judge it properly, and we're not going to do so because it was not really a complete work.
No.
There's stuff in there that I enjoyed. There's stuff in there, I'm going to be honest, I didn't enjoy so much. It's potentially a little bit of a mismatch between the choice of musical styles to represent people's characters and the piece itself. I don't demand authenticity. I don't need 14th century music.
Well, God knows, exactly.
Yes.
I mean, we only have some understanding of what that would have been. But
it's sack butts all the way.
There we go. Well, that's the title of your next musical, perhaps, Sack Butts All the Way. But
you'll swarm in your seats. But we saw another musical.
We did.
Entirely different in tone and feeling, and of course using a different format. And
but
that was
also set in the UK, so they have at least that.
There's your
in
link,
common.
yeah. It was called St Trinian's, and in fact, actually, at one level, St Trinian's culturally is very British.
Yeah.
Historically, it was originally a set of amusing cartoons about a truly unruly girls' school.
That's right.
Set, I think, in the 1940s and 50s originally. It then was turned into a series of very successful British films, starring a lot of much-loved British character actors and actresses.
Such as Joyce Grenfell
and Alistair Sim, a man
Yes.
playing the head teacher.
That's right.
So that tradition of transvesticism in British theatre and film. And various others. I think George Cole used to play Flash Harry, who was a spiv.
Okay, yeah, that's right.
And these girls were unruly and, they were a horde, essentially. They were very rarely identified individually. You weren't given characters in the St Trinian's film. It was usually how did the teachers wrangle the situation around this sort of ravenous, in all senses, horde.
Yeah.
And there were several series of that, and it's come to life periodically. There was another film in the 1980s, a St Trinian's film.
That's right.
And then more recently, in the last 10, 15 years, there's been, I think Rupert Everett was dressed as the headmistress in the ones from the last 15 years. Of course, over the years, it's become slightly more sexualised.
I think that's true, yeah. I think there's been a sort of, well, actually, and then possibly gone back the other way again, but gone out of fashion. But yeah, I think there was a period where St Trinian's was just sort of, jolly hockey sticks. A bit
vicious jolly hockey
after
sticks.
the manner of Daisy Pulls It Off, but as you say, a bit more sort of a bit more hard bitten, shall we say, than the girls in Daisy Pulls It Off. Of course, Daisy Pulls It Off has the same sort of
plot,
same idea. Really, it's in essence it's a schoolgirl hero type of story.
Who saves the school? Yes,
who saves the school? Blah blah blah. So what we get here really is, what do you expect of a school musical in the sense of set in a school? You usually expect to have a newcomer, and they're sort of like trying to make their way in the school, like Sandy in Greece, for example.
How do I find my place in this new environment?
Yeah, and you get that a lot. I can't remember if School of Rock has such a character, but again, similar sort of premise. You expect there to be a head teacher. You expect the school to be in difficulties in some way.
Well, the head teacher gives you hierarchy, so there's always a hierarchy. Someone's above you.
Someone's in charge.
Who says no to things.
There's usually who's top, as in who's sort of, you might have the head girl or the bully or the mean girls or any of those things. Who's the
High School Musical, in fact, as well. This is there too. It's in the American system.
Musicals. It's all about sort of social status, really.
Ryan and Sharpay.
And typically, you have to get everybody together to solve a problem at the end, which typically for this kind of genre you solve by putting on a show, playing a sport, winning a quiz, various possibilities.
Some feat of togetherness.
Yes, has to get you through to ensuring that the school survives or that the kids win, or there's various sort of possibilities. I mean, Matilda has a bit of this as well. It sort of brushes that genre on its way through to the main plot, So it's power. That's what school musicals are about. They're about who has the power and who's got the influence and who wins out, finally, as having both power, influence and popularity. That's three things. So I suppose power and influence are technically the same thing. And so this musical does produce like those goods generally. It's a little bit confused in which ones it prioritises, because if you take a comparison with, there's a film that we watched recently, The Best Years of Your or Their Lives.
The Best Years of Your Lives.
Of Your Lives. Yeah. That is an old movie with Margaret Rutherford and Alistair Sim again, which predates the St Trinian's movies, which has the basic premise that the boys' school, because of the war or austerity or the new Labour government or whatever it is that's going on, then
a bureaucratic falls up anyway. Yes.
Yeah, because of the men from the ministry have decided to billet a girls' school in the premises of a boys' school,
while the boys' school's still there.
While the boys' school is still there, and by sheer bad luck, there's going to be an inspection as well at the same time, so that the masquerade of it being only a boys' school or only a girls' school has to be maintained for the most important visitors. In fact, I think it's anyway.
There are two separate inspections going on in circle, but
it's a foundational sort of bit of how these school musicals work, basically, even though it's not a musical, and so. Yeah, so that's what happens. So they have that in this, because there is a boys' school, there's a girls' school, there's a bit of competition between the two, and there's a bit of old flames type romance between the headmaster of the boys' school played by a woman and the headmistress of the girls' school played by a man.
Quite.
All of which is hugely entertaining and
Yeah.
very traditional and good fun, and works well. But there's also this other plot of the school being in trouble in another way, because there's going to be an inspection and there's going to be bills that haven't been paid, and there's sort of
The school's going to
the school's
financially
on the
go
uppers.
under.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so that plot is there as well, and it has to be rescued. So there's two things already going on which perhaps don't quite complement each other beautifully, because the stakes in one plot are different from the stakes in the other plot. And so, and in the meantime, of course, the third strand that they deploy is I'm the new girl, I'm a bit geeky, I'm a bit sort of off the wall, I'm not quite, what everyone's looking for in their head girl, but I intend to work my way up through the the ranks of social acceptability sort of thing, and so she does, and so that's the third plot. Now you can have two of those in. I think possibly three at once was too many.
Another point we need to make, of course, is one of those points I'm yet to resolve, I think, when it comes to virtual theatre, particularly at the EdFringe, which is that once again it was a reduced, condensed version.
Yes.
Which means editing choices have to be made, and the problem is you can sometimes see the joins.
Yes.
And we had a bit of that. Every now and then the plot didn't quite cohere,
No.
but then again it was because, and it said so in the closing credits, what we were seeing was a kind of a condensed version which had been chopped up, and now it fits, it's about an hour or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Now, in live theatre in Edinburgh, you book your slot and then you have to fit your show into it. And very often the slots are either you do pay a lot of money and go for 2.5 hours.
Yes.
Almost nobody does that. The normal size slots are 1 hour and 15 minutes, or more likely an hour.
Yeah.
Which means you get to see a 50-minute show because it's 5 minutes in and 5 minutes out.
Yes.
Or you get to see a show that's made it up to a full hour and 5 minutes because it's 5 minutes in and 5 minutes out. As far as I can see, on the virtual world, there is no compulsion to do that.
No.
But it's interesting that both these shows we're talking about today were reduced. Now, I know that The Crooked Spy wasn't reduced because of any kind of external requirement for time. It was because actually the funding they'd had was to create a partial video.
It wasn't finished, yeah.
I don't know what the reason for this was. I noticed on the credits at the end, it was filmed in July. We should say the format is a camera pointing at a stage, cut with several different cameras, but it's that version we were talking about, and was an easier and better thing to understand as a result. There are some.
But the reason for the time constraint, I think, persisting is that it's the economy of attention, isn't it? 2 hours is a significant investment of time in our crazy, fast-paced world of today. And,
Sweetheart.
Yeah, exactly. And particularly for this kind of product where it's not Netflix. You're not. It's going to be. It might be worth the investment of time, and it might not be.
I accept that, but I would much rather have seen, even if they'd been able to bend it up to an hour and a half, a more coherent. The fact they slimmed it down to an hour made it too incoherent for me to fully enjoy, when I think there's a really enjoyable show in there. I did enjoy it, don't get me wrong. I actually thought it was great fun, and we'll talk about its many strengths in just a minute, so we're not being critical here. But in terms of, I think there were two things going on, and I think you've hit the nail exactly on the head in terms of the fact slightly too much packed into the plot and the subplot and then the secondary subplot. And then there was too much condensed out when it was boiled down to an hour-long show. And I fear that the two things have worked against
I think this happens
success.
all the time in these circumstances where extracts, shortened versions, whatever, are done. Unless you've written it to pace into the time that you've got, then it's not going to work. If you've written a 90-minute show and you've just sort of doing
cut out half an hour,
it's not going to work as a show, because why would it? You've written it at 90 minutes and it won't take that amount of cutting. So,
which is why I think it's a pity that it wasn't the full version.
Yes,
myself.
Yes, or that they hadn't written it as if for 50 minutes in the first place. It's a tricky decision, I suppose, because a lot of people are like, well, I'm going to do this at Edinburgh because it might get attention, and then of course if it does get attention or gets done anywhere else, it's going to be done at 90 minutes, maybe with no interval or something, and it does need to have sufficient material to, but really the answer is you rewrite at that point, actually, and because the concept is still there. And anyway, but that gripe aside, I guess I would have probably managed 90 minutes of that, with a few more numbers. They did a little bit of interesting choices with the numbers. Like, there was a strong opening number which talked about centrinians and so on. It suffered a little bit from slightly unclear lyrics, and so a lot of what it was saying... It's a mixture
of diction and also the volume balance with the backing track.
Yeah, which is a common problem in these things. And so I was a little bit I didn't quite feel like we'd been introduced to the world of the piece, as it were, which is of course what is supposed to happen in the first thing. A lot of the others did get... Oh, and that's right. And we had the headmistress her first number was that she would rather have been a dancer. And you can do that. Like there's in Betty Blue Eyes, isn't there? There's one about the inspector wanting to have been a painter.
Yes.
And so it sort of falls from that tradition. But actually, I didn't think that number worked very well, the painter number, because it was just too silly a diversion from the real character of the person. What you actually want to know about the headmistress at the beginning is like what's she doing here?
Yes.
And so...
Also, in fairness, because we're going to talk about this, that was the second song, the Teachers I Want song.
Yes.
The third song was the New Pupils I Want
Which
song.
was perfectly sensible.
It was a very good song. In fact, they were both quite jolly songs, but they were in the wrong order, we thought. Because actually, you made the very good observation that I am new here in this school and here's what I want to do.
That goes close to the beginning.
Yeah, that is still the main driver of the story.
What do you do with a BA in English? It's that kind of song, isn't it?
Whereas the teacher story, in fairness, the two head teachers were, in old-fashioned musical comedy parlance, the secondary comedy couple. And therefore they are the runners of the subplot. And because it came before what appeared to be the main plot, which was... We have to call her the new girl because actually in the credits they don't appear to have names. They are called new girl and head girl and head teacher.
I feel that was a bit mean of the writers not to give the character some kind of name.
I actually quite like that conceit, but everyone is a stereotype.
It slightly sort of underlines that though, and perhaps encourages that sort of performance.
Yeah. And there were various other things. It was a kind of torch song, but some of them were just in places you think, oh, hang on, this is a little bit too early or a little bit too late.
Yeah. There was just something a little bit off about the pacing and choice of order. Yeah.
So there were lots of really good things as Eric Morecambe would say. I am playing all the right notes, just not necessarily in the right order.
And for example, they had like a good St. Trinian's, which was a sort of close of Act 1 number, I think. Again, up St. Trinian's type of number, where there was a lot of rap. And it really was well done.
And it delivered as well.
Yeah, I could believe the lyric style of that, and it was it was good.
Well, let's talk about score, because we both thought, and you particularly, that actually the score was where it really scored.
Yes, haha.
Once we got our ear in and could start hearing what was saying on, and later on there were some really excellent examples of good diction.
Yes.
So it's just a pity about that first opening number. But actually, the song's what I would call comfortable, easy musical theatre rock.
Yeah.
Or in this case, comfortable, easy musical theatre rap.
Yeah.
I, as a man who doesn't listen to rock and doesn't listen to rap, was perfectly happy listening to those songs. I thought the orchestrations really made most of those songs land, and there was enough verbal dexterity in the lyric writing to really for something to be happening. It was craft was on display, I thought.
No, definitely, and I'd say it was or on display to the extent to which diction allowed. Which of course, I think the other thing is because there was a lot of patter in it. I mean, sometimes you do have to vary the pace to just get a little bit more.
Now, patter in this sense, are you talking about patter as in a patter song, or are you talking about the spoken dialogue linking bits between verses?
Both, actually. I mean, in the sense of like a lot of words in this score. It's not a simple. There wasn't really like a. I mean, actually, there wasn't a romantic plot, main plot. There was the comedy, the secondary couple, but there wasn't actually a primary couple.
No, there wasn't. That's a good point. Yeah.
And so, which was refreshing in a sense, because it would have been a bit of a cliche to have like a boy from the boys' school or a girl or two girls even. As the romantic couple would have been perfectly okay, but they didn't go there. But because there was therefore just a lot of information in the songs and things, but there isn't that stop type of number where it's just slow. You can hear every word, and you catch your breath a little bit, and you get to see what's going on. So so I felt that was probably the thing I'd like to have seen one of, even if it wasn't occasioned by romance in this case, which it usually is. The sort of more I cannot wish you type of number where everything just stops for a minute and just a little bit of emotional clarity, Yeah, it was nonetheless a strong score, and but they did struggle to compete sometimes with the backing tracks. I didn't notice that.
Yeah, did you get the impression the backing tracks were recorded?
Yes.
Because there were several moments, and I think this is picking up on the point you were making.
Well, actually, not necessarily, because there was a sort of band call at the end.
Ah, yeah. Cause
I wonder if it was just to do with the mix, actually, rather than whether it was backing tracks or... I mean, often these things are hybrid now anyway.
Yes.
There's often like a click track and and so on. So.
It's just, it struck me that in some of the songs where there was a little bit of dialogue between moments of singing, but actually everyone was really huffing their way through the dialogue super quickly, and so it wasn't landing. And I thought that's because you've literally got X number of seconds to get it out, so you've got to throw it out, rather than having the underscore, if you like, hang around long enough for you to naturally deliver it.
It may or may not have been for that reason. Certainly if it was running to a click track, then it wouldn't matter whether there was live performers or not in that particular scenario. Yes. But there's all kinds of ways around that nowadays. In terms of the headmistress character, I thought was pretty much the central character, and was certainly in the walk down was billed as such, you know.
Well, she got the top billing, didn't she, in the last one out. I should say I really liked the actor who played the headmistress. I liked the fact that they'd gone for the man playing the woman, but I also then liked the fact they balanced it up with the headmaster of the boys' school being a woman dressed as a man. So that worked really well, particularly as they were the couple destined to be.
One thing I wasn't sure of, because obviously a lot of the school was very contemporary, had rap and things like that, was, are we in contemporary St Trinian's, 50 St Trinian's, you know, what is the sort of premise, what was the type of world we're in? It felt like it was now.
Yes, I'll talk about that in a second. I just want to say how much I was admiring the head teacher, because I really liked her first line. She comes in halfway through the opening number, and one of the school girls wants to stop her about something, and she says, no, girls, I can't stop, I'm just about to prepare for my drum solo. And I thought, you know, that's how you want to introduce a head teacher. You know everything you need to know about her. But she's not really very interested in being a head teacher, but she's got her own ambitions. And of course it turns out that almost immediately in the next scene that the school's in financial ruin because she hasn't paid any attention. She said, I never read those envelopes.
Yes,
you know,
exactly.
So she's got a bursar character basically who does it all for her.
That's right.
And discovers the hole in which they are. Anyway, I thought she was a great success. And it's interesting that she was billed as the top character, but actually she is mostly, certainly the version we saw, there for comedy purposes, there to get them into trouble rather than to get them out of trouble.
She's not the motor of the plot.
No, she's not at all. And this was a couple of things just in terms of the plot. In Act 2, there is a competition, as we've identified is so often the way, in this case a kind of quiz, to win money in order to save the school from financial embarrassment or closing down. What I liked comically was the fact that actually, even though it looked like they're then going to win at the last minute, they actually don't win.
Yes.
And I quite like that kind of counterintuitive...
It's great. It introduced the slight plot hole, didn't it? Of like, well, then how do they save the school exactly?
But I love the way they threw it away, and then there was a subsequent resolution. So I quite like that. And then we were also talking about, bearing in mind we got her I Want song very quickly, the headmistress, which was to be a dancer. It doesn't pay off. Funny enough, in Act 2, that she and the other head teacher pair up and are then content to be teachers again.
Yeah,
it doesn't quite.
It's just not quite enough beats in that sort of arc, as it were.
But you were asking the question about when was it set. Now that's also interesting because there are lots of speech marks, contemporary references. The boys' school is an academy, and in British terms, that's a new form of school, so that can only be in the last 10 years. There's lots of references to various Conservative prime ministers and cabinet members of the last 10 years.
Yes.
So that also sets it there. The thing I had trouble with is, in my head, St Trinian's is absolutely a public school, or a private school at least.
Which in British terms means a private school.
It's not run by the state. It's a company.
That's right.
Whereas an academy, I don't know if there are companies or not, but they're sort of deemed to be on the public side, i.e. the state side.
They're grant maintained, aren't they?
So why would they... There was a sense that used to be the boys' school. The boys' school's become an academy, and the
think
girls' school has stayed private.
I think it may have been confused thinking on part of the writers, but actually it also, I think, does indicate there's a bit of a shift in like education culture, because you have these sort of academies nowadays that are run sometimes in quite rather like little private fiefdoms and rather after the manner of private schools. In fact, they sort of are private schools, except for the fact that they get a big wodge of cash from the government for having sort of students. But it's true that it's odd.
Yeah, it didn't quite... The rivalry between the schools wasn't really set up. It was also interesting, I thought, that the rivalry between the schools was almost entirely through the head teachers, and that's because of a failed previous love relationship.
Yes.
Rather than actually... We never see the boys of the boys' school and the girls of the girls' school actually head-to-head, except in the quiz.
It's a light-hearted, not particularly full-headed musical. I think they could have done something with the politics of education that would have made it very clear that it was about today's events, if you like, but they didn't really pick up that opportunity, and they didn't have to, in fairness.
Well, let me ask you the question, and I think this ties in with something you said much earlier, that this is very firmly in a tradition not only of British film comedies, which are not musicals, but you've mentioned Moby Dick is very close to this. Daisy pulls it off, not a musical, but is very close to this.
Yeah.
At Edinburgh the last couple of years, there was something called 3 Cheers for Maisie,
Yes,
which I don't even need to tell you what that was, because you know what it is.
We can tell
and it was
just the title.
excellent, by the way, but it was exactly the same kind of story. New girl saves school in the face of opposition.
Yeah.
So my question, therefore, is, it's called St Trinian's because in this country St Trinian's has a kind of cachet and a reputation at least. But did it need to be St Trinian's?
No.
Because I agree with you there, and the reason I agree with you there is because I think the dynamic of a St Trinian's film is in fact not about the girls. No. It's about the grown-ups trying to corral and wrangle the girls and the scrapes they get into as a result of that. And the girls are just a force of nature.
Yeah.
And here, that was sort of embodied by the fact that no one's got a name.
Yes.
But they were given individual characters and personalities. So the girls suddenly became dynamic.
There was a goth girl and there was a sort of
plastic
geeky girl.
Posh girls.
Right,
yeah.
And of course there was this head girl who we haven't really talked about, who was she's got a sort of Cockney accent, so that was interesting.
Straight out of EastEnders she was, yes.
Yeah.
And the point you're making there is she doesn't quite fit in with the public school girl demographic.
Again, it's not quite clear what we're getting at here. Like, she's top dog, and so she's a bit of a bitch, basically. To mix the metaphor.
Oh, I don't think you've mixed it that much.
No, actually, no. To keep going on that metaphor, but she's not the antagonist. It's not clear whether she's sort of an opponent of our new girl, the rival of the new girl. Like, there is a little bit of that in, but it's never quite fully expressed. So we can't quite tell if our principal antagonist is the headmaster of the boys' school or the head girl of this school, and what is the actual main plot strand.
Yeah.
I think you could easily have had two antagonists. No reason you shouldn't, But you also need a principal heroine, and that should have been the new girl.
Funny enough, in Jesus Christ Superstar world, she would be the Judas character, but the Judas character, of course, then joins in with the other enemies of Jesus, who were the sort of Pharisees.
Well, yes, I haven't really thought of that.
In an unholy alliance, if you pardon the expression. It doesn't do that. She doesn't, in her dislike of the new girl, she doesn't join forces with the boys' school.
In my version of the story, she wins she wins over the headmistress.
Who's she here? The head girl?
The new girl.
The new girl,
The new girl's mission is that she has to, doesn't matter in which particular order, she has to conquer the risk of unpopularity by proving herself to the other girls. She has to take on a rival among the girls and defeat or join forces with or in some way neutralise that particular threat. She has to persuade the headmistress of the school that she's a worthy, representative of St Trinian's, despite sort of things. And finally, then takes on the external antagonist, which is either the inspector or the head teacher of the rival school or the whatever it is, or even, you could get quite silly, and it could be the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
You could go that far, right?
Like Made in Dagenham.
Yes,
where
that's
Harold Wilson
right,
unexpectedly turns up.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and gradually, wins everybody. And so I think that's the sort of dynamic they were going for, but they just didn't quite have structurally everything in place for that.
We should say it's a work in progress.
Oh, it's great.
Clearly a work in progress, but I think it just needs a little bit of tidying up.
Yeah.
And as I say, we think the score is very good. The plot elements, I said, they're nearly all there. They're just not all quite in the right order.
It's the same dynamic as How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, where he works his way through the ranks in an assortment of interesting capers.
But there's an obvious villain there, isn't there, as a Bud Frump?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Who is ostensibly his equal.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? So, that would be an interesting struggle. Anyway, we're not rewriting the show here.
No, nor do we want to.
We are, but we shouldn't be. But in any case, it had a lot of the elements, and the score was zippy. I thought it was great. It was, it was fun. It was often funny. It's very difficult to write funny lyrics in the middle of music. It's just not one of life's easy tasks.
No, it isn't. And when it works, it lands.
And they did it very well.
Yeah.
There was and it was quite panto-y, I thought, in some of the jokes that they chose, and there was a mixture of sort of like contemporary reference jokes and and sort of just.
But it had the feel, didn't it? It was larger than life. To be honest, just having a man dressed as a woman is always a bit pantomime-esque, and it was not going
dynamic.
and it wasn't trying to escape that, and nor should it. I think it did do a little bit of fourth wall breaking, but in not you observe this. You can get away with occasionally chucking in a swear word. Pardon my language. There's a couple of fucks.
There are, yes,
or rather more than a couple actually, and that works occasionally because what it does, it gives you the Brechtian dissonance that takes you out of a scene and actually acts as a punchline. But you can't overdo it as a punchline.
Yeah, you wouldn't have that many exactly. Well, maybe you would in a contemporary school. I don't know, but
but we're not going for realism here.
No, we're definitely not. No. So I think that that would be something they could change a little bit. Not necessarily because I do like swearing.
Oh, it's not. It's not prudery. It's just you can overdo it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Make it work.
It's just it's a tool that you can use quite powerfully for a good laugh, but you can only do it twice.
Yeah.
At the most. So maybe 3 times, rule of 3.
So bringing us back to where we started on this conversation, which is essentially about formats.
Yeah.
The Crooked Spire was a valiant attempt within a very difficult way of doing a musical.
Yeah.
And therefore has to be recognised as being held hostage by its own format.
Yeah.
This was what actually is much more traditional, a film of a stage show, because they were all on a stage in that kind of bubbled sense that you were talking about, filmed only... Well, it was filmed in July, I noticed, only a month before the Fringe, in conjunction with the EdFringe, which was interesting. So it was planned to come to the Fringe, so presumably it was after the social distancing rules had been turned off. But it was a more... To my taste, it was a fuller theatrical experience, or certainly a more enjoyable watching experience, because... Although you have the passivity, even of 2 or 3 cameras, of watching what's happening on stage, it gives you one extra level of distance.
Yeah.
It still allows you to connect much more clearly with what's going on.
I think the other thing that's interesting about this is that it's created this little vector for shows to be seen, which is presumably a bit cheaper than putting on a full Edinburgh Fringe show, because although you have to pay for the costs of, maybe performers, maybe not, probably not performers, but you probably have to pay for the cost. You have to pay for the costumes. You have to pay for the sets, and so you have to pay for the camera and the filming and all of that sort of stuff. But I doubt if you did that in your hometown, that's going to equal the cost of getting it to Edinburgh and hiring the venue and publicising it and trying to get an audience. Because here, obviously, you want an audience, but you can afford a bit more risk, in terms of the audience you get. And so it could be an interesting vehicle to try and get a platform for stuff that you hope is going to be taken on further without the trouble, as it were, of going to Edinburgh. Whether that's going to be work or whether the shows that bother to show up are going to be the ones that get the rewards, I don't know. But
well, let me tell you now,
theatre's never fair. I do know that. Like people who put in effort is not proportional to results.
But you do need some.
But you've got to have But on the other hand, you cannot get anywhere without effort.
Your rocket may still explode, but you've got to put the propellant in.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I think what this new possibility, vector is the word, and I think it's still actually the better word. I can't find a thesaurus alternative for you. Mm-hmm. Is that it's suddenly going to make much more easy the idea of having an international tour for your Fringe show. Yes. And I'll tell you why, because there's another show on as part of this year's EdFringe called Colour Between the Lines with no U, and that immediately told me it was an American show, and it was.
Yes.
But what I noticed was that when I was watching it, I think it said that it came from memory, the Denver Fringe Festival, or whatever it was. It had been already. This was a recording from another Fringe Festival. Yeah. There's no reason it shouldn't be in Edinburgh, and I'm not in any way criticising it. I'm glad it was there. But what it does mean is that it was very unlikely, I imagine, the people behind it were ever going to be in a position to put it on in Denver and then fly everybody over to Edinburgh as well. They may have been, but it may have been their master plan. But now they can. And they could have taken it to the Brighton Fringe, and they could have taken it to this Fringe and that Fringe and goodness knows where Fringe, and the Hollywood Fringe. Yeah. I noticed on the Hollywood Fringe, which is taking place this year in August at exactly the same time as the Edinburgh Fringe, that there's at least one show that was entirely created and filmed in Britain. Right. But they had elected to take their show to the Hollywood Fringe rather than to the Edinburgh Fringe.
So you get a bit of a mix and match effect.
Yeah, and that I don't think you've ever had. You've obviously always had shows from all over the world, but let's be honest. 80% of the musicals at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe are British productions. Yeah. They may not be British musicals, but they're British productions where they're new or revivals of already created shows. So I think that's what we're going to see. I think just by keeping in touch with Edinburgh, not just physically but virtually in future, if this continues, I will suddenly discover that I'm also visiting Hollywood and Denver and Australia and as I mentioned, the Seven Deadly Sins was a German production.
Yes.
I mean, it's in German, but I believe I could be entirely wrong, but I got the impression that they were German performers.
Right. Yeah. No, it's an interesting sort of disruption, as it were, to the sort of fabric of theatre, and to how shows might or might not be produced in the future. I do think we will see more hybridisation. I mean, the last 20 years, COVID or no COVID, have seen like...
Who wrote that? The last 20 years?
Who knows? Yeah, so for the last 20 years, COVID or no COVID, you've had site-specific theatre has become very important. The whole sort of notion of interactive theatre. I mean, these were all concepts that existed long before 20
of
years
course.
before, but even so, they've become in an environment where you're competing with computer games as well as television and film.
Yeah.
Theatre has started to take its cues somewhat from gaming and from sort of other interactive type of
That's true.
media, and tried to find ways of theatricalising those. And so, and the other thing is that there's this increasing sort of mixed media type of element of theatre where it's kind of routine now for a theatre show to have a bit of projection or a bit of film in it or a bit of whatever. There's nothing remarkable anymore about that. It's just become routine. And sometimes the opposite as well, whereby you have a bit of a theatre as part of a live experience, which is, you've already seen the film, or you watch the film as you walk around, or there's hundreds of ways of doing it. So I think this is now part of that fabric. I think the idea that you sort of make your pilot, in your hometown or wherever, and then try and hybridise that into something, theatrical.
Further.
Yes.
It's interesting, then it's the different journey for television. It's certainly in Britain, television, which was always used to borrow from theatre and be theatrical in style, has lost all that grammar and language and is now cinematic as it is in America.
Yeah.
So in a way, television has been taken over by film. Film has won in terms of the culture there.
I think film was always going to win there because I think film was there first anyway.
Well, that's true.
And so I think television always aspired to being film, but sometimes was more like theatre in some of the ways we've discussed, because it sort of had to be because of budget and stuff. And the other thing, of course, is that the television and film landscape has sort of atomised a little bit. We have the BBC. It's coming up to 100 years old. The reason it exists in the very first place is because it's very expensive to make any such thing, and of course now it's very cheap to make any such thing. At least if fundamentally all you need is a mobile phone or a few mobile phones, and the ability to edit, and of course all of that comes not for free, but
much cheaper than it used to.
Cheaper than it used to, and the only things that still cost the same as they always used to are costumes and sets. So people who are doing stuff that doesn't rely on costume sets, as we said at the beginning of this, are able to produce stuff.
But it's interesting, of the different media, and we just said there that film is essentially, and I hope people won't take offence at the word, but film has sort of colonised television.
Yeah.
But I think theatre has colonised, exactly as you were also saying, other forms. I think it's the gentrification. It's going to take over things rather than being taken over.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing that through this.
It's been an interesting couple of years, really. I mean, interesting in the Chinese sense for theatre. I mean, devastating would be another word I think people would use. But there's always creativity and there's always an attempt to do something a bit new, and so at least we have that.
In the next 5 years, it will be very interesting to see that we have a conversation like this in 2026 about virtual shows at Edinburgh being as a matter of course, and how they changed, whether they seem speech marks less amateur.
I think it's made me realise a little bit as well, like live theatre to me, I was often a little bit ambivalent about live theatre for myself.
You like dead theatre, do you?
Yeah, no. But what I mean by that is that sometimes you think, yes, this had to be a live show. I was there among the performers. I had a sensation from the bass in the in the room. The site that they chose was like extraordinarily evocative. Yeah. All of that is like true theatre. And I've equally often, and usually in the West End, to be honest, sat down and thought, they could just film this and I'd watch it at home and I wouldn't have had to have bought dinner tonight. And I would have been just as happy, really, because it's a fourth wall production and I don't feel like I'm up,
The intimacy is gone.
I'm not really that involved, in whatever this is. And so I think both of those things are tugging in opposite directions, and there's people will evaluate what they think theatre
should be. Yeah.
What's the point of going somewhere for theatre as distinct from, what can be entertainment if you just can watch it from home?
But the flip side to that, and I agree with you, I think it's a whole bunch of different dynamics pushing and pulling, and ultimately it's a personal choice. I think for me, as you know, I would normally go to Edinburgh. I'd normally go for X number of days. I'd normally see X number of shows every day. I'd really pack it in, and it can be very weary making. It's very tiring. It can make you ill even, as we've discussed in other episodes. But the intimacy of Fringe, I still find it life-enhancingly thrilling. And the interesting thing this year is I did not physically go to Edinburgh. I made the various evaluations on what's available, how safe I felt, blah blah, the amount of money.
Yeah.
And I therefore chose to do it virtually this year. And as it happened, as I say, 80% of the musicals were virtual. So that made it very easy. But do you know, I found it very interesting. The time I had set aside for my usual trip to Edinburgh, I could not bring myself to watch any of those virtual shows.
Yeah.
I had to sort of say to myself, right, I'm going to miss these unless I do it. And then I forced myself to watch them. And I then enjoyed them.
Yeah.
But I enjoyed them at a different level of enjoyment than if I had had the chance to see them.
Yeah.
I enjoyed St Trinian's watching it virtually, but there is that distance.
Yeah.
Whereas I think if I'd been in the auditorium, I would have got more out of it, even though it had been exactly the same show. And for me, it is getting that more out of it, which is the added value of going to a theatre. I appreciate, it's expensive, dinner,
Yes.
la 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 la. But I still prefer the in-venue physical form of theatre because I think it creates a level of atmosphere which I can't generate on my own or with friends in my living room watching it on a screen.
No, and I think actually it's true. I mean, we watched this thing together. If I'd just had it available to watch and I was going to get round to watching at some point, chances are I'd chuck it on a tablet in the corner of the room and pay you about 65% of my attention to it. And of course, that does diminish the effect clearly. And one of the things with theatre is you get forced
to engage,
to be present, to be in the room, which sometimes is worth being, and at other times is torture.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
Well, Tim, thank you very, very much. I mean, that was a very interesting conversation, not just about two musicals at this year's Edinburgh Fringe, but also about the formatting. And I think this is a conversation we'll probably be having again on Musical Talk over the next few years, because it is, if you like, and you've said quite rightly, it's been around for a long time, but it's been given an impetus, and it's got a momentum now. Where that momentum is going to take it and in what direction is going to be interesting. And it has yet to find its form, its grammar, its feet.
The other thing, sorry to, I know we're sort of wrapping this up, but the other thing is just about the length of things, because the length of Fringe shows has been determined, as you rightly said earlier, by practicality.
By the booking.
The length of theatre shows at sort of either 2.5 hours or 3 hours or 1.5 hours increasingly these days is also determined by the sort of realities of the market and sort of what people feel is enough time that is worth them coming out, but not enough time that they're bored, and so we've seen a lot of formats coming up, where people have done YouTube series and where they've done sort of TikTok series. We're literally talking about 30-second pieces here.
And podcast musicals are very clearly coming up.
Yes. Yeah. So we haven't yet really seen what practical pressures drive the length of what will be more musicals in sort of more digital forms.
Yes.
And podcast is one where that's pushed towards a long form because people have a journey. They want 50 minutes, they want 40 minutes.
Over 10 weeks or whatever.
They don't particularly want it to only last for 10 minutes because they're then going to find another podcast. But equally, stuff you watch at home, you might very well have the attitude of, I'd rather just watch a 10-minute thing and another 10-minute thing and another 10-minute thing to fill up my evening, and then go to bed at the time I choose, sort of thing. But yeah, anyway, interesting.
Well, Tim, I think that brings us to the end of this conversation. Do you feel crooked or do you feel inspired?
Well, yes, I who knows?
Musical Talk. And there we are. That was Tim and I in conversation, talking in depth about the Crooked Spire and the Girls of St Trinian's, but also within the context of the various formats of virtual theatre and how, in a strange way, it's the Wild West. It's a landscape for musical theatre which is yet to be tamed, and we haven't yet developed the grammar. As I said at the end of that conversation, it will be really interesting to find out in, say, 5 years, what the virtual theatre landscape, particularly at various fringes, will look like. I'd be quite surprised if it feels in the way that it does now. I think it will definitely have moved on. And for us as punters, I suspect it will feel almost as natural as going to the theatre. Although, as you also heard me say, for me, my money is always better spent in a theatre than watching it on a screen. Well, that's it for this week's episode of Musical Talk. We'll be back again next week with something completely different. But don't worry, we haven't finished our coverage of this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe. There'll be more episodes about that coming up in the next few weeks and months. But we do like to try and mix things up a bit here at Musical Talk. And sometimes we go so far as to go beyond mixing them up into muddling them up. So before this episode descends into a cloud of chaos, with dust and filth and mud being splattered in all directions and me ending up with egg on my face, let's bring it to a perhaps graceful end. And there's only one way to do that, And you know as well as I what that is. There's only one format option here, and I'm going to use it now. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk edited by Thos Ribbits and presented by Thos Ribbits and Tim Saywood. Copyright Musical Talk 2021. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. Right. Do you want to speak again?
Yes, I want to speak again. Here I am.
Like you did last summer.
Like I did last summer. Let's speak again, as we did last year. Do you remember when?